The founding of Georgia. The story of the founding of Georgia begins with a social problem that England was experiencing in the 1700s. Sometimes, when people could not pay their debts, they were placed into a special kind of jail called debtor's prison. Entire families, including fathers, mothers, grandparents, and even tiny babies, could be imprisoned until a debt was paid, or the person who made the debt finally died. An architect named Robert Castell was placed into one of these jails. Castell immediately began to write to all of his friends for financial help, but unfortunately the mail moved very slowly in England in the 1700s. Soon Castell's small stash of money began to run low because he had to pay the jailers for things like decent food, blankets, and the right to send letters from jail. When his money finally ran out, a jailer forced Castell to move into a cell with other poor prisoners. Some of them had smallpox. Castell caught the highly contagious disease and died before help or money ever arrived. An Englishman and former military general named James Edward Oglethorpe received one of Castell's letters and hurried to help him, only to learn that he had already died in Fleet Street Prison due to his poor treatment and neglect. This made Oglethorpe angry. Fortunately, as a member of England's House of Commons, a branch of Parliament, Oglethorpe was in a position to help the situation. Along with other elected officials, he began an investigation into the practices of England's prisons, and soon supported new laws to protect the rights of the poor and those who were being mistreated simply because they could not repay their debts. During this process, a minister in London, Dr. Thomas Bray, suggested an alternative plan for England's poor. Why not start a new colony to which the poor could relocate and begin a new life? This would serve to relieve England of the issue of thousands of unemployed poor and to provide these individuals with a brand new start. Oglethorpe gave his support to this plan and began to act. Oglethorpe persuaded 20 other members of Parliament to support Bray's plan, and together they wrote a petition to King George II, asking for land in the New World on which to begin a colony that would both help the working poor and provide military defense for the wealthy English colony of South Carolina against a possible threat from the Spanish who were already established in St. Augustine, Florida. In Georgia history, the 21 individuals who planned and initiated this dream are called the trustees. On June 7, 1732, King George granted the petition and issued a charter for a period of 21 years. In his honor, the new colony was to be called Georgia. Georgia's original charter extended from the southern boundary of the Altamaha River to the latitude line that marks the state's modern northern border with Tennessee and North Carolina, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. If this were still Georgia's territory, Los Angeles would be a Georgia city. Oglethorpe began to take the lead in advertising for colonists, conducting interviews, and organizing the first group. Because of the hardships involved, the trustees decided that only skilled applicants would be accepted for the initial voyage. After all, these individuals would have the task of building a town and possibly fighting if the Spanish were threatened by a settlement so close to the lands they claimed in Florida. It was finally decided to only accept male applicants who had families and who were able to fight. Also, these gentlemen had to have a useful skill or trade that could help the colony. Sadly, none of the people selected by the trustees for transport to Georgia were actually released debtors. Oglethorpe's dream of helping the poor was not achieved by the founding of Georgia. On November 17, 1732, approximately 120 people left England bound for the New World, with just one trustee on board, James Oglethorpe. The ship, Anne, was at sea 88 days. During that time, 2 babies died. After many weeks of boredom and limited food, the ship finally made landfall in South Carolina on January 13, 1732. Oglethorpe then decided to take a small group of men and to travel separately to the area that the charter specified. He knew that in order to assure a peaceful settlement, he would need to respectfully approach the Native Americans who already lived on the land. Oglethorpe could not speak the Indian dialect, so he employed two traders, John and Mary Musgrove, as his interpreters. Primarily through Mary, Oglethorpe was able to communicate with the local Yamacraw Indian chief, a fellow named Tomo Chichi. Oglethorpe purchased land about 18 miles upriver from the Atlantic Ocean on which to build the settlement. On this high bluff overlooking the Savannah River, he and the other settlers began to organize the town. Oglethorpe drew the city plans using some of the ideas of his architect friend, Robert Castell. He named both the town and the river Savannah. Each settler was expected to begin right away clearing land and building their homes. Oglethorpe oversaw all of this and pitched in. Once the town was well underway, Oglethorpe turned his attention to building forts, where men could be stationed to watch the Spanish, who had a huge fort in St. Augustine, named the Castillo de San Marcos, or the Castle of St. Mark. The Spanish fort could house hundreds of professionally trained soldiers. In almost laughable contrast, the largest of the three forts built by Oglethorpe on St. Simon's Island was called Fort Frederica, and could house only about 15 men, most of whom were artisans or craftsmen, definitely not professional soldiers. During the first few years, other boats arrived with people who asked to join the colony. Since many of the original settlers died due to malaria during the first summer, it was especially fortunate when a boatload of Jewish settlers arrived. One of their number, a doctor named Samuel Nunes, is credited with ending the malaria epidemic that was killing many of the colonists. Also, some Salzburgers, a group of German Protestants, arrived and asked for land on which to settle. They were given an area north of Savannah that was to become the second city in Georgia, Ebenezer. Ships were also returning to England. On one of these trips, Oglethorpe traveled to Scotland to recruit experienced soldiers who might be interested in immigrating. Oglethorpe recruited some Scottish Highlanders to come to the colony with their families. On purpose, this group was given land for a town to the south of Savannah. It was understood that these men would have the task of forming a militia or group of citizen soldiers, and be asked to fight if the threat in Florida ever came too close to the settlement in Savannah. Their job was to act as a buffer to protect the main settlement. When war broke out between England and Spain in Europe in 1739, it was not long until hostilities spread to the New World. This war also spread to Georgia, where it is commonly called the War of Jenkins' Ear, because of the mistreatment of an Englishman named Robert Jenkins. Captain Jenkins sailed his ship a little too close to Spanish territory in Florida and was captured. Of course, the Spanish assumed that he was spying and smuggling, and evidence suggests that he probably was. The Spanish cut off Jenkins' ear as a warning to any other ships that tried to get too close to their fort. Hostilities escalated, and for a few years Georgia settlers and Spanish troops in Florida seesawed back and forth with victories and defeats. Finally, in 1740, a large Spanish force was sent to attack the main English settlement in Savannah. Oglethorpe had divided his forces and anticipated the attack. One group waited with Oglethorpe along the main route to Savannah. The other, his Scottish brigade, was hidden in a swamp on St. Simon's Island to guard the back entrance to Savannah. On the morning of June 15, 1740, the Spanish attempted to get to Savannah using the swamp route. When the Spanish came through the swamp, the Scottish attacked and defeated the Spanish in a skirmish that has come to be called the Battle of Bloody Marsh. Though not very big by today's standards, the battle was decisive enough that the Spanish let the colonists alone from that point forward. Oglethorpe was a hero, sort of. He had ended the Spanish threat, but some men in the colony and later among the trustees questioned why Oglethorpe had chosen not to follow the Spanish back to Florida and capture the Castillo. Oglethorpe was ordered to return to England and to answer for his actions before a military court. Also, Oglethorpe had made enemies of some of the settlers with his strict enforcement of the trustees' rules. Rules prohibited the drinking of rum. They also limited the amount of land each settler could own. The rules prohibited unfair trade practices between settlers and the natives. Rules also prohibited the owning of slaves. And rules also said that only male heirs could inherit land. All of these policies were very unpopular. Some of the settlers began to grumble about the regulations they had to abide by, rules their neighbors in South Carolina did not. Oglethorpe returned to England to face the court and was acquitted of all charges. But he soon made a decision that led him to never return to Georgia. Oglethorpe decided to get married. He never again visited the colony that he had helped to found and to make successful. Georgia continued to prosper economically, but they did so without Oglethorpe. Over the next 20 years, Georgia had a succession of leaders, some of whom were royal governors. These men failed to continue Oglethorpe's rules, and soon most were overturned. In 1752, Georgia's management transferred to the King of England, and in 1754 he appointed a royal governor, John Reynolds, to supervise the colony.